Andor Season 1 finished off with this idea that going into Season 2 we'll get to see more of the Empire's secret work when it comes to building the Death Star, and much of the plot will likely be leading up to the events of Rogue One. And while we more or less know who will be returning to the show, I think it'll be more interesting to talk about who might appear in Season 2. So let's get started. Given that Andor is all about the early beginnings of the Rebel Alliance, it only seems right that we also get to meet the early leaders of the Rebel Alliance. Now, the show has given us Mon Mothma and the shadowy Luthen Rael, but I think there's a very good chance that we will get to see someone like Bail Organa in Season 2. If at all, I think it would make the most, if not perfect, sense to the plot. Given how important Alderaan's support was to the Rebel Alliance, it just seems right that at some point the show will introduce a key figure like Bail Organa into the fray. We already know for a fact that in Kenobi, roughly 9 years before A New Hope, and 4 years before Andor, that Bail was already an avid anti-imperial and someone who was already plotting some sort of resistance against the Empire. We do know for a fact that Bail Organa had founded one of the earliest rebel groups on Alderaan and secretly kept watch for any reports or rumors of rebel activity across the galaxy. Alongside Wedge Antilles, the two of them had already set out to secretly recruit members and ships to the cause, and Tantive IV being one such example. And so the fact that we didn't get to see him in Andor Season 1 is actually a bit of a surprise. Given how closely Mon Mothma has worked with him in the past and his former position as Senator of Alderaan in the Senate, it seems rather inevitable that Cassian and Bail's path will cross, and I think Bail's role in Season 2 could very well be huge. Bail's contribution to the Rebel Alliance was particularly valuable when it came to creating an intelligence apparatus to intercept Imperial transmissions. Through this activity, he was able to identify and reach out to certain rebel groups, persuading them to join the cause. Not to mention, being the head of an affluent world such as Alderaan also meant that he had the financial power to equip the rebels as well. So we could very well see all this play out in Season 2, helping Luthen and Cassian pull together different factions to form the Rebel Alliance. By extension of Bail Organa possibly appearing in Season 2, I think we could also see a young teenage Princess Leia as well. Although not quite the dominant leader she would later come to be in the Rebel Alliance, Princess Leia at this point was already well versed in her adopted father's dealings, and frequently helped with the foundation of the Rebel Alliance. During her teenage years, she would actually accompany her father to Coruscant as a senatorial aide, and saw Mon Mothma as a bit of a mentor. Even though she was not in a position of senior leadership within the rebellion at this time, she was still pretty crucial in its foundation. So I really think that it would make a lot of sense for her to maybe appear in a scene or two in the second season. Given the proximity of her age, she could very well become a good friend and guiding presence for characters such as Lida, who is also around the same age. The show could very well feature a growing friendship between the two that ultimately brings Lida closer to the rebellion and possibly changing her negative perception of her mother through the eyes of other people. And speaking of all things senatorial, I do think it's high time that we also get to see Sheev Palpatine make an appearance, at the very least from a distance. Season 2 doesn't really have to feature Palpatine heavily or up close, but I think it should at the very least give the audience some idea of the political day-to-day life on Coruscant and the difficulties Mon Mothma constantly has to go through. Even though the power of the Senate was very much diminished by this point, there's still a chance that Palpatine shows up to ceremonially push through a bill. But my theory on how Palpatine could just briefly appear in the show actually has something to do with an upcoming key event in Season 2, something which was frequently mentioned in Season 1.
We should find some Gorman guests for tonight and see how amused they are. Your fun friends just cut off their shipping lanes yesterday. Do you know how many will starve?
The issue with the Gormans will eventually boil over to something called the Gorman Massacre, in which hundreds of peaceful Gorman protesters were crushed by an Imperial Star Destroyer, at least in legends. This particular event was so horrific that Mon Mothma actually decided to deliver a speech openly in the Senate, condemning the Emperor and blaming him as the culprit. This particular speech was what drove Mon Mothma into hiding, giving her the space to become the official leader of the Rebel Alliance. So imagine in season 2, Mon Mothma, after learning about the Gorman massacre, decides to give her speech and times it exactly the moment Palpatine decides to visit the Senate, perhaps on an unrelated issue. Imagine the impact Mon Mothma's speech would have if she condemned the Emperor right in his face. I think that would go a long way to demonstrate the fearless leader Mon Mothma will eventually become, and what a great Star Wars moment that would be. Speaking of the Gorman massacre, I think the man behind the atrocity might also be given a chance to briefly appear in season 2, that man being Tarkin. During the Gorman massacre, he was the one who ordered the Star Destroyer to be landed, but I also think that there is a good chance that Tarkin might appear for another reason, that being the Death Star. As we see in the closing credits of Season 1, the Death Star will be a central focus of the plot in Season 2. My theory is that we will get to see the Rebellion catch wind of what the Empire might be doing, and all of this really leads back to Grand Moff Tarkin. I do think that we will get at least a brief mention of the character, but given how big he was in the military scene, I wouldn't be surprised if we were treated to a scene or two. One of the important focal points of Rogue One was the internal Imperial rivalry between Tarkin and Krennic.
I will tell him that I will be taking control over the weapon I first spoke of years ago, effective immediately.
We stand here amidst my achievement, not yours!
And given the importance of the Death Star in Season 2 moving forwards, don't be too surprised if Krennic appears in a few episodes. Keep in mind that by the time of Rogue One, the Rebellion was already familiar with who Krennic is and with his work, so the show could very well take the time to explain just how the Rebellion and Cassian in particular got to know about Krennic and what he was doing. Given how top secret it all was, there's bound to be some rebel investigation or spycraft involved, the sort of thing that would fit very well in Season 2. And if we're talking about the creation of the Death Star, then we also have to talk about the planet-killing weapons chief architect, Galen Erso. Given how unique Galen's story is, I think it would be very wise for the show to at the very least feature him in some way. Keep in mind that as we discovered in Rogue One, Galen was actually good friends with the likes of Saw Gerrera, which is part of the reason why he entrusted his daughter to him. Galen had already escaped and defected the Empire by 17 BBY, however, by the time of Andor Season 2, which takes place just before Rogue One, Galen should already be back in Imperial custody, something which we saw in the movie. But what this also means is that during the time of Season 2, Galen should be actively trying to find a way to get word to the Rebellion about what is going on, something which he later achieved through Bodhi, the Imperial pilot. On top of that, by the time of Rogue One, Cassian was already familiar with Galen's work, which is part of the reason why the Rebel Alliance decided to burst Jyn out of prison in the first place, in hopes that she would be able to provide some information about the whereabouts of her father and establish contact with Saw Gerrera. So Season 2 of Andor really just provides the perfect opportunity to see the different ways Galen might have tried to get information out to the rebels, and how Cassian learns about the existence of Galen and his work. Really just the perfect moment to build up and lead into Rogue One. So those are the characters that I think might have a good chance of appearing in Season 2 and how that might occur. Anyways, that's all for this video. Be sure to like and subscribe and let me know what you think in the comments down below. I am the Lost Acolyte,
and I have spoken.